Hi, welcome to History of the Modern World, Week 3. In this lecture, we are continuing our look at the development of the Americas. Now, to recap from Week 2, we left the American continents just after the Wars of Independence, and we ended up leaving very young and fragile independent nation states between the United States and the former Spanish and Portuguese colonies. The revolutions were based on the ideas of liberalism, and particularly for Latin America, definitely regional patriotism. So, for this week, what we're really looking at is how successfully have these nations developed over the past 60, 70 years? What is their identity, their national focus, their international focus? What about their ties to the old motherland? Are they good or are they bad? And how well does the present state uphold the ideals that it was based off of? We're actually going to be starting off with Canada first because I think it's a good look at how many loyal British colonists are responding to the American Revolution. It's also helping to tie in how individuals of different backgrounds, different nations of origins, are actually trying to form a unified state into one nation. Now, Canada does not, and of course has not to this day, attain complete independence from the British Empire. They are still part of the British Commonwealth. And yet, for the most part, during this period of time in the 19th century, they do gain a great deal of personal autonomy over their internal affairs, as they really move away from being a colony with a great deal of colonial administration coming from Britain and begin to have their own system of government, their own judicial system, etc. Now, Canada is combined of English and a former French colony, and there's a great deal of concern over the very young United States. Many British loyalists actually fled the United States and went into Canada or went into the British Caribbean after the American Revolution. And this is sort of the primary factor in retaining unity between French and British Canadians. British Canadians who fled were definitely fearing reprisals from the new American state, and both French and British Canadians who had been there to begin with are very much concerned about the United States and their willingness to expand their borders. Are they going to try and expand into the Canadian frontier? There is definitely reason to believe this because of the War of 1812. Now, the War of 1812 for the Americas corresponds to the Napoleonic Wars on the European continent. At this time, it was not uncommon for British sailors who would be impressed or basically forced or threatened or coerced into joining the British Navy to try and escape into American ships to get out of the very stringent Navy conditions. And so British officers in the Navy would basically say, look, we should have an informal warrant. We should have the right to be able to board American ships because they might be harboring British sailors. And at this time, there's very little difference between an American and an Englishman, at least in terms of accent, in terms of background, etc. Because the United States still very much has so much of their British heritage, it would be very easy for one to cross to another. Now, this is of course dealt as an act of aggression by the United States, that they are being boarded by an outside country. And so the U.S. response to the repressment is to, and of course also the fact that their shipping, their trade is being blockaded in Europe because of these wars against France. The response is then to declare war against Britain. Now, from the nature of the circumstances that brought up this war, you would think, okay, naval battle against Britain, and that's certainly a part of it. But actually, if you remember back to the French and Indian War and the idea of different theaters of war, America is actually looking towards gaining territory in Canada, gaining victories in Canada. The idea that, well, it's closer to us, this will be an easier war to fight. And if we can distract the British with what a threat we are in Canada, maybe they'll sue for peace. Well, the War of 1812 does not go terribly well for the United States, and Britain, again, tied very much more to their concerns on the continent, eventually help establish peace. But these failed invasions into Canada and this real threat of the United States and the fact that there is expansion westwards um, is really an indication to the Canadians that they have to focus on their own unity if they're not going to become swallowed up by the U.S. Now, the Canadian provinces are really, it's really not one united Canada. It's really more composed of a loose confederation of provinces. And it's actually pretty difficult to rule Canada as a colony. Canada requires an independent police force, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, and there's a lot of minor rebellions because there's really more of an attachment to one's own particular region and their own ethnic identity rather than to Canada as a whole. It's really only when you bring up the United States and potential friction with the United States that you see more of that unity between French and British Canadians. So there's a lot of minor scale failing to unite the entire nation against Great Britain. So while there might be rebellions against British influence, it's never going to attain the height that the American Revolution did. So there's definitely a willingness to definitely stay within the Commonwealth. Commonwealth status means that while they can control their own internal affairs, the external international affairs are going to be still controlled by Great Britain. And yet, Commonwealth status is something that the majority of Canadians do actually want because they're going to have still those protections of Great Britain. And yet, they, like the Americans, have had their own experience at creating their own self autonomous government. And to really have issues, to have politicians that have a regional connection with them. Now, even though Commonwealth status means that the Canadians themselves now have more direct participation in their government, it's still a significant struggle in trying to govern such an ethnically disparate population. One of the issues that your book brings up is the rivalry with the Métis, um, which would be the French Canadian correspondents to the mestizos in Latin America, and the French Canadians in the West, with the English speaking settlers that are trying to expand into the West. The Red River Rebellion and the Northwest Rebellion, led by Louis Riel, are examples of how these French Canadians and these Métis feel that their own way of life is going to be persecuted by this continuous English expansion. Now, there are some conciliations given towards the French-speaking Canadians. In some cases, they are allowed to continue to speak French in their schools, in their places, businesses. French is allowed to be taught to children, and yet the English-speaking Canadians are going to be dominating national affairs. Now, as time goes on and Canada becomes more comfortable with their Commonwealth status, yet they're still going to have a very tenuous relationship with the United States, particularly in terms of economics. They're very much concerned that the Industrial Revolution that has really taken off into the United States is going to actually overwhelm Canadian industry, that more consumers are going to actually want to pay for US made goods rather than paying for Canadian made goods. And there's also the issue of very sparse settlement outside the major cities. So, again, that concern that expansion by the Americans could always be a considerable threat.